music or anything. Um, we're just gonna go right into it because I'm currently in the middle of a Wintertodt fight. But yeah, I hope everybody's doing good this morning. Oh God, I got damage interrupted. You're gonna hear that a little bit because I'm trying to figure out what exactly I want to watch. Um, oh shit. Okay, do that. Eat that bread. Um, oh sh. I hate that. I think what we're gonna do is we could watch a Richard Wolf video, and it's gonna take a decent amount of time. What? Why is this not okay? I'm just chilling, doing nothing right now. Apparently. Yeah, we're gonna watch this. I'm surprised this is actually a
Hello,
shorter.
Professor. I'm sure that everyone joining me knows who you are, but just in case you don't, this is Professor Richard D. Wolf. He is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show Economic Update, which I highly recommend you watch. His latest book is The Sickness is the System When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or
Wintertodt is my
Itself,
version
which
of
is now also
gambling.
available as an ebook. It can be found along with his other works, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at democracyatwork.info. So, welcome, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So, there are a few questions that we'd love to get your insight on. My channel and the political perspective of my channel is a little more in depth and a little more into the theory than you might be used to in these sort of interviews, and I hope that's all right with you. My first question, and one I got requested from my audience, is what are your opinions on the political and economic nature of China and its particular trajectory, with a focus on the question of imperialism, whether you consider China to be imperialist in the Leninist sense? Could we get your opinion on that, please?
Sure. It has always been the case from the earliest days of socialism, and the same is true of communism,
See, I love his
that
answers
different
because
people
he's gonna ramble
interpreted
on for
what
fucking
these
20 minutes.
words, what these terms mean. And the debate
Let's
has been
go.
sometimes very strident, very loud, very intense, and at other times less so. Uh, by some definitions, then, China is a socialist economic system because, in these definitions, socialism represents a powerful, perhaps even dominating role of the government in regulating, taxing, shaping, influencing what the economy does on a day by day basis. In these definitions of socialism, some would argue it's perfectly okay if the capitalist system functions under the control of the government, that there are private enterprises
Oh
owned
fuck.
and operated by citizens who have no particular role in the
That was a
government.
second round. I thought
These
that was in
can
the middle.
be the total story of industry, or it can be a split system. Some run by the government, some enterprises, some industries, others run by private entrepreneurs, private owners, and operated. Scandinavia uses that concept of socialism. Germans, French, Italians, and others also do. The socialist parties in many parts of Europe advocate a socialism that's defined in that way. Traditionally, particularly after the Russian Revolution, when socialism split, a different interpretation became powerful that took also a different name, communism. And in that name, it was imperative that the government own and operate all of industry, or most at least of industry, directly as state enterprises. And you have those in the Soviet Union, you had them in the Soviet Union, you have them in the past of China, and you have them in the present of China. And by these definitions, these are socialist societies, whether it's Sweden or the People's Republic of China. Um, but there are definitions that are different. And in those definitions, neither of these societies, that is, neither the social democracies of Europe nor the People's Republic of
Where
China,
is this guy?
qualify for the term. And that's just a matter of the definition. Let me explain. There is a way of looking at socialism as a fundamentally different economic system in the sense of how production of goods and services is organized. You can read Marx or Lenin or any of the other great thinkers in the tradition as having a view that socialism is not about the greater or lesser role of the government. Indeed, I'll overstate the case, but to make the
Yo,
point
how's it going,
clear,
buddy?
it's irrelevant whether the government has a
Doing some
larger or
Wintertodt. I'm
smaller
probably gonna do
role
like
in regulating or
80 or
taxing,
90
or for that matter,
matches of this.
running businesses. Much more important for the socialism versus capitalism debate or discussion or differentiation is the question of the organization of production. Capitalist organizations have a split between a minority that run the
What are you up to
enterprise.
today? Are you gonna be
They are
streaming anytime
called
soon?
employers, and the majority who work in an enterprise who are called employees. In this definition, capitalism exists if and when and to the extent that the employer employee organization of production is in place in the economic system. The alternative would be a completely different organization that can be called a communism, which has sometimes happened, or can be called a worker cooperative. That's a more familiar name. And the basic idea there is no split
Shit, it's
between
gonna break.
employer
Oh.
and
Didn't break?
employee.
Cool.
All
Just
the
relight that.
participants in every
I still haven't
enterprise
gained a
are
construction level
both
because of this yet.
part of the collective employer and part
The
of
next
the
time it breaks and I
collective
can
of
fix it, I'll get that level.
employees. And they have a kind of democratic system, one worker, one vote. All decisions are made collectively, democratically. The kinds of decisions, including what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with any profits generated or
Ooh,
any
I am
surplus
out.
generated in the enterprise, if that is done democratically and collectively by all the participants, well, then it qualifies as having gone beyond capitalism. And by implication, clear implication, if you have not done that, if either you're private or you're public enterprises, either of them or both of them, continue to utilize the employer employee structure, then they would not qualify under this definition under the term socialism. So
I'm just
if you
gonna chuck
use
these in.
that last definition, then the People's Republic of China is not a socialist society. Or if you use the European social democratic definition, then it definitely is. I don't have any sense of there being any authority that tells you which of these definitions is somehow legitimate and which one isn't. I could enter the debate and talk about which ones I like more and less and where I line myself up, but I understand that there are different traditions. Socialism is a
Really
global
quick,
social movement.
6400 fire
Marxism
making experience
expanded
right
from
there.
Marx's death toward the end of the 19th century, and over the last 150 years has gone into every society in the world. These are societies at utterly different levels of economic, political, cultural development, and of course, they interpret the works of Marx or Lenin differently. And that difference is a reality that will play itself out, but there's no authority that can designate one of them as right and the other one as wrong. Insofar as you connect, as Lenin did, the desire, the need to control other countries so as to secure their markets for yourself, or to secure their raw materials or their food to feed your own working class. If what you mean by imperialism is this move to control foreign, then any society with an employer employee division, particularly if it makes profit its bottom line, as most societies with employer employee relationships do, well, then they will exhibit this movement to control their sources of inputs of raw materials, food, and manufacturers, and so on, and likewise to control their markets. That's how capitalism has always worked. And if you see capitalism as the employer employee relationship, well, then you would conclude that China participates in doing the same sorts of things.
Thank you. Many people would follow that train of thinking and would agree with you. There's one prominent side of the left that has a perspective I would like to get your opinion on, though. Their belief is that China's system is a mixing of both private capitalist and state capitalist formations with a communist party in the so-called commanding heights of the economy, so to speak. And they're in an extended new economic policy directed at developing the productive forces to a point in which the level of development would allow for abundance, where we could transition or lay the base to complete the construction of socialism, or at least enter into the primary stage of socialism as it was described by Lenin. Would you agree with the statement, and could we get your opinion on it?
Sure. I think it's a perfectly reasonable inference based on what I just said in response to your first question to see the People's Republic of China as making a kind of new economic policy, a version, if you like, of what Lenin led the Soviet Union into in 1921 or so. Um, I understand that letting private capitalists flourish, which they did in Russia, in Soviet Union, and they're doing obviously in the People's Republic of China, is intended by them to solve a whole raft of economic problems that hopefully will get them to a point where they can make the further transition. I commend them for understanding that what they are doing is not what socialism is, even in their definition, whatever exactly that is. In other words, that they have much more to do. I would qualify this, however, on a number of points. Number one, achieving economic growth, or whatever the word abundance is supposed to suggest, it's clear to me that that may be a necessary, but it is certainly not a sufficient condition to make the transition. That transition will be a difficult, rocky, um, deliberate act if it's going to happen. There would have to be the political, ideological, cultural commitment to radically transform China in this case to achieve such a definite a transition. To imagine that it's somehow smoothly going to flow from economic growth is to repeat the kinds of thinking that Edward Bernstein or others indulged in at the end of the 19th century, imagining that capitalist growth somehow by itself or automatically or peacefully is going to make the transition to a socialism. I think that is unlikely and a very dangerous way uh, to plan on what you're doing. I would also comment that there's a very famous speech Lenin gave either in 1921 or 22 before he got sick, in which he says explicitly that the Soviet Union is not yet a socialist society. And what he means, as best I can recall and remember, very important speech, is he refers to the Soviet Union at that time as a state capitalism in which the working class, through the Communist Party, has captured the state and so now has an unusual, extraordinary power over what remains a capitalist system, but one that the state is in command of. And then he infers from this, he draws the conclusion that the question now is when and how the working class control of the state through the Communist Party can make the next transitions that have to be made to get the Soviet Union beyond state capitalism. 8 or 9 years later, after Lenin has died, and after the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky has been resolved for Stalin, Stalin makes the extraordinary statement that we have achieved socialism, albeit in only one country. He
Mm,
therefore, by a stroke, declares that he's basically changing the definition from what it had been in Lenin's mind, which said that Soviet state capitalism was just that, a state capitalism, to now declaring that the power of the Communist Party being what it is, uh, even if they have employer employee relationships in production, it is socialism because of the power of the state. In a way, Stalin therefore moves away from Lenin's more greater focus on the organization of production to a more Scandinavian social democratic notion of the power, the regulatory power of the state. And it leads to this notion that socialism has been achieved in the Soviet Union. And that has been the basis for both subsequent Soviet and much of the history of the People's Republic of China referring to their society as
mm.
socialist.
Thank you very much for that lovely and in-depth answer. Of course, there could be points I can add on further, but we're tight on time, so I think we should move on to the next question. I would love to get your opinion on planning versus markets within socialist economics, particularly within socialist nation states and their economic policy. What your opinions are on strictly planning in the form of the Gosplan that existed within the Soviet Union or similar institutions within other socialist countries. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at roughly? No?
Yes, I understand your
Yeah?
question.
Lovely.
In any case, let me answer it this way. I have been mystified all of my adult life by the fascination on the left of the differential between prices and values in Marxian
Mm,
economics, and equally so on the debate between the public and the private, and then equally so on this planning versus the market. I find this extraordinary.
mm,
I think all three of them are diversions from what I think are the central issues that ought to be capturing people's attention. And I feel as though the enemies of socialism and Marxism have been able to define what is to be debated, and that already tilts the playing field in their favor. I would urge people to think about that. But you asked the question, let me answer. First of all, the word planning, without a lot of qualifying adjectives, leaves open an immense field,
mm,
which is part of why this debate is bizarre to me. Every large multinational corporation plans everything.
mm,
Indeed, it does so using many of the same tools that were developed, for example, by Gosplan in the Soviet Union and by the leading economists who developed linear programming planning models that have now been adapted by private enterprises because they understood that that's what it is they need to do. A
mm,
large corporation usually gets that way uh, by having, along the way of its growth, purchased and integrated all kinds of other companies, competitors, provide suppliers, buyers, vertical, horizontal integration. These multiple enterprises, as they are brought under one roof, require planning.
mm,
Basically, what these corporations have done is gotten rid of the market. They don't want to have the market because it's too uncertain. They don't want to depend on the market to set the conditions under which they buy key inputs. And they don't want to rely on the market under the condition of having key buyers who buy their outputs. They want to control inputs and outputs, reducing market fluctuation and market uncertainty. And the logic of this is true not just for a corporation, but for an economy as a whole. You have more control, particularly if you are a governmental apparatus, whether that's local or centralized government or decentralized, really doesn't matter. But you can exercise more control, remove all kinds of fluctuations and risks if you substitute planning for markets, which is why all large capitalists have always done that and are doing it now. There's nothing odd or weird
Mm.
about socialists or communists or anybody else who wants to organize the economy as a whole to want to do the same thing. And so for me, this is a practical matter of how to achieve objectives. If you leave things to markets, you leave things to all the calculations made by people who are not focused on the global outcome.
Mm.
That's one of the problems of markets. That's why societies of all different kinds have tended to repress or limit or control. You can go back 5,000 years and see the debate between Plato and Aristotle about markets. Footnote, they didn't like markets. Plato wanted them gone altogether. Aristotle said we can't do it, it'll be too disruptive, so let's regulate them tightly. For them, markets were disruptive of social cohesion. That's their phrase. Exactly. That's
Mm.
what they are. You can do it, you can distribute goods and services through market exchange, but you will pay the price of fluctuations, interruptions that can ramify across the economy. Number
Mm.
one. Number two, I don't like markets for all kinds of other reasons. And these are very simple. A market allocates scarce goods and services to people with the most money to pay for them.
Mm.
I find that extraordinary. If milk is in short supply for whatever reason, I don't want the people with the most money to be able to buy the milk to feed their pets.
Mm.
I'd rather have the milk go to feed the children. If the children's parents don't have the money, that's an interesting factoid, but I don't care because I have a different standard for what should happen when goods and services are scarce.
Mm.
And let me close this point by dramatizing to people. During World War II, when a huge portion of the resources of the United States were diverted from civilian goods to produce military goods for the war effort, the remaining resources usable for consumer goods meant that the quantity of consumer goods would be drastically curtailed.
Mm.
Had the distribution of those consumer goods that were still being produced been left to the market,
Mm.
only rich people would have been able to get the consumer goods. They would have bid up their prices until everybody else could not afford them anymore. That's how the scarcity would have been happened. It was determined by the government of the United States, Republicans and Democrats, who were 100% pro-capitalist, to dispense with the market. We set up a system in the United States called rationing. In order to buy a gallon of gas or a quart of milk or a pound of sugar or ounces of meat or many other commodities, coffee and cooking oil and all kinds of other things, you needed a ration card. If you
Mm.
didn't have the ration card, the storekeeper could not sell you the
Mm.
product. And he would go to jail if he sold it to somebody who didn't have a ration card. And how did you get a ration card? The government
Let's
distributed.
go, level
And
2.
how did the government distribute it? According to, get ready, people's needs.
Oh.
If you had a large family, you got a lot of ration tickets for milk. If you didn't have any kids, you didn't, and so on and so forth. So
Mm.
abolishing the market for a planned distribution using umpteen different possible systems is a triviality. Doesn't have much to do with the capitalism socialism debate and
Mm.
shouldn't have been allowed to become a focus of debate because it takes that debate away from
Mm.
much more crucial issues like whether you have an employer-employee dichotomy
Mm.
organizing your factories, offices, and stores, or whether you have a democratically run collective of the workers doing that.
Mm. Thank you very much for that lovely answer. I think we only have time for one more question, and that is this. Both myself and those that watch my channel are well aware of your work, your channel, and your views, particularly on cooperatives and the rearrangement of the organization of enterprises. So my question is, what is your view of cooperatives going into socialism? Like in a capitalist system, let's say for example in the current United States or whatever other country, say Bangladesh for example, if there was to be a buildup of cooperative enterprises or reorganization via buyouts, like workers buying out their enterprises and reorganizing, if that were to happen, how would the next stage or transition to socialism occur? My question somewhat falls into the reform versus revolution question. How would the conquering of state power, if it were to take place at all, how would that play into simply reorganizing the enterprise? Is that enough for us to reach socialism, or is there another step required after this buildup of cooperatives?
If you're asking how it's going to work in the future, the only honest answer I could give you is I don't know. Nobody
Mm,
does.
mm,
But what I can do, and what I think you're asking me to do, is to give you a sense of how I imagine or see such a transition coming. So
mm,
let me do that, and hopefully that responds to your question.
mm,
I would expect that the evolution and development of worker co-ops produces in the economic system something comparable to what Lenin and Trotsky and the others called dual power.
mm,
In other words, you're going to create an alternative economic structure. Worker co ops are going to be a part, if they develop, of a society in which capitalistically organized
I should
enterprises,
roll.
that is hierarchical, with a
I should
tiny
roll.
minority at the top, the owner of the
Joint.
business, the board of directors if it's corporate, and so on, make all the key decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits, versus a worker co-op where those same decisions are made by everyone. No one is excluded. One person, one vote, majority rules, democracy. These two enterprises are now going to be coexisting. And that means that every government program in such a society is, whether you intend it or not, going to become
Let's go. Let's go.
contested.
Doesn't matter at this
That
point.
is,
Let's go.
the capitalistically organized
Yeah.
enterprises want the government to sustain and support
Jesus.
them, as it has in every capitalist country, or at least the history of the capitalism in each country. The worker co-ops are going to have an alternative set of demands that they put on the state. If subsidies are to be given out, they want some. If the tax law is to be changed, they have ideas on how to do that. If capital is scarce for worker co-ops to get going or to enlarge, they want the state to address that. The capitalist enterprises are going to push in alternative and often contested ways. Well, the capitalists have something already that the co ops don't have. The capitalists have political parties. In the United States, for example, they have the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats, who are each outdoing the other to be supportive and celebratory towards capitalism. Worker co ops, by contrast, have no political party. So the next step, to answer your question, is for the worker co-ops to understand that they have to do what the capitalists learned they had to do as they emerged out of feudalism. They had to develop political parties that were advocates at the level of the state, whether the state was a king or the state was a parliament, it really doesn't matter. Their political parties, starting small, had to grow to become powerful enough to shape governmental policy to enhance the capitalist enterprises whose growing wealth would allow more resources to shape the politics in a back and forth that
mm,
explains the last 200 years of capitalism. I would expect something comparable to happen, that the worker co-ops understand, both for their advance, but also for their protection of what they already have. They need political representation and they need political parties, and they will form them. And just like in capitalism, the worker co-ops will be the economic base of such a political party. It will raise money, it will recruit, it will spread the word, and the parties, in turn, will put into place elected officials and others who will get the legislation that enhances the growth and power of the co-ops. Could there then come a time when frictions develop, hostilities develop, and we then have a conflict between the capitalist sector and its parties on the one hand, and the co-op
I said I
sector
wanted to roll a
uh,
joint, and now I'm still
and its
smoking
parties
this.
on the other, and that becomes akin to a civil war? Absolutely, that's one way that this may get fought out. In some parts of Europe, the capitalist parties basically were able to eventually take state power with not too much in the way of civil military strife. In others, they couldn't. They had to go to a military solution. The French Revolution is the obvious example. But the English Revolution, a century or so earlier, and even the American Revolution, the decision was made in the United States and it was debated. Do we want to become independent and set up our own monarchy? No. The decision was made, not only do we become independent from the British monarch of the time, George III, but we're not going to set up our own monarchy. We don't want a monarchy. They made the break from the feudal, the residue, if you like, of
Yeah.
monarchy. And I think worker co-ops will be in comparable struggles about the political shape of their growth within a capitalist system that is, in my judgment, already having fundamental problems that it cannot solve.
Mm. Thank you so much for that absolutely phenomenal answer. If you would indulge us, just to piggyback off that question, in your book Contending Economic Theories, where you take a look at neoclassical Keynesian and Marxian concepts, there's a passage in which you consider the Yugoslav experience of cooperatives and cooperative buildup. You speak of it positively. My question about this is, what would be the criticisms of the Yugoslav implementation, and would it align, or are you familiar with the criticisms of that type of system made by, for example, Yakovenko and Cockshott in critiquing what they would have considered market socialism with the cooperative presence? Simply, my question, very condensed, is what is your criticism of the Yugoslav implementation from the economic perspective, less so the political overbearingness?
Okay, there are a number of ways to do this, although how you could separate it from the political in the case of Yugoslavia strikes me as difficult, and I'm not sure why you would really want to do that. What I like about Yugoslavia was, let me be blunt, they were daring. They wanted to take the socialism that they had inherited, European socialism, and take it right down into the workplace. Since that's something that matters a great deal to me, it's how I understand, interpret, and teach Marxian economics and have all my life. I take my hat off to this effort to bring the revolution right down into the enterprise, to trust the mass of people, to imagine that they can be more than the drones of labor that capitalism has always made the majority of people. The folks who come 9 to 5, 5 days a week or more, whatever the case may be, do what they're told, how they're told, where they are told, and at the end of each day go home having lost all connection. Marxism likes the phrase alienation with the fruits of their labor, of what they have poured their brains and muscles into all day long. This is a horrific psychological and social catastrophe, and that they were willing in Yugoslavia more than the Russians or other Eastern Europeans, with some exceptions. Collective farms in Czechoslovakia and so on are important exceptions. But with those exceptions, they were willing to try to set up genuine worker-run, worker-owned enterprises. The problem is when you have that move, you then have to adjust all of the other institutions of a modern economy so that they do not
Dudes.
undermine, run counter to, obstruct what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. Look, it's a truism in the history of markets that markets are different depending on the class structures they mediate. How
Mm.
does the market affect, for example, slavery had markets. Every American city in the American South has a monument somewhere to the slave markets that existed
Mm.
in Charlotte, in Atlanta, in you name it, wherever it was. Uh, Markets in slavery are different from what the markets were in European feudalism. And each of them is different from what the markets were in slavery. Markets are powerful, socially influential institutions. What
Mm.
you have to do is you have to change the way markets work in a society like Yugoslavia was trying to create so that they reinforce and do not undermine and disrupt what you're trying to do inside the enterprise. That had to be learned by each social system that tried to use markets. And by regulating markets, I also mean suspending them,
Mm.
not using markets when it isn't the best way to go.
Mm.
When the very social structure you're developing in an enterprise is better served by abolishing the markets here. That's why I gave you the example of the rationing in World War II.
Mm.
It was better to win that war and reinforce American capitalism. It was better to abolish the market in a whole raft of consumer goods than to keep it going. It's a
Mm.
mechanical way of thinking to think that these institutions all have to line up at the same time in the same way. They don't. You need to understand what is your priority and
Mm.
then adjust the institutions. To make a long story short, I don't think the folks in Yugoslavia figured that out, understood
Mm.
that, and took the steps that were necessary. And I don't
Mm.
mean to be a Monday morning quarterback. I doubt that anybody could have done much better than what they did. But
Mm.
they also then had the problem, which is crucial, and I need to say it. If you understand what we're saying, those of us that advocate the abolition of the employer
Mm.
employee relationship, or to use the same language to say the same thing, if you really understand what it means to abolish the class structure of the capitalist enterprise,
Mm.
well, then it follows that the political system, like the market, has to be adjusted to that reality.
Mm.
You now have to understand that the state is no longer dependent upon and interactive with the people of a capitalist system, namely the people who run the enterprise.
Mm.
It is now directly connected to the mass of people since they're the ones who run each enterprise in the workplaces that they are engaged in. You have to give them their space.
Mm.
You have to give them their right to make mistakes, to make judgments
Oof.
that may or may not be consistent with your economic plans.
Mm.
This is a very complicated, delicate kind of adjustment. It's comparable to the adjustments capitalist governments had to make in the transition from feudalism, or feudal governments in the transition from slavery, and those were difficult transitions. But this one is difficult too, and I don't think, however great a wartime leader he was, Tito, the leader in Yugoslavia at the
Mm.
time of these experiments, I don't think there was a developed understanding of what trusting the people, which is what you have to do here, what that
Mm.
really means. And I don't think they thought
Oh
it was
sh.
possible. And look, they may have been right. It may not have been at the
Mm.
time.
Wait, I
But
didn't even
then
finish.
if you make that judgment, then your
I
options
need to
and
pay
what you
attention.
could have done, including internally to the worker co-ops, would have been very different from what they seemed to have imagined they
Mm.
could do. And when they failed, of course, then they failed catastrophically.
Mm. Absolutely fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
I am very grateful that you found the time to come and talk to me today and to impart your knowledge on me and everybody else who will enjoy watching this video. Um, if you could, possibly on these topics that we discussed today, for example, China, markets, planning, Yugoslavia, if you can think of any book recommendations that you may give that can further expand this discussion, please feel free to say so. Otherwise, we can just continue to the end.
Sure. I have written three books over the last 3 years
Mm,
um, that were mainly written in order to answer the flood of questions that come into us because I do a lot of public speaking. So
mm,
if these comments I've made are interesting, let me simply mention them because
mm,
they will contain elaborated versions of what you just heard me say.
mm,
The first one, published about 2.5 years ago, was called Understanding Marxism. The second one, published a year later, was called Understanding Socialism.
mm,
And the third one was just published a few months ago, is called The Sickness is the System When Capitalisms Fail to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself.
mm.
All three of those books are available at our website, which is democracyatwork.info. That's all one word, democracyatwork.info. So, anyone interested, that would be the best way to get a more elaborated presentations of these points.
Mm. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. This has been a very eye-opening talk, and I hope that everybody has learned a lot from having the pleasure of listening to you speak. As for me personally, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. On a personal note, I've been watching your videos, and I've read almost every work you've published. I have not read your bachelor's thesis yet on colonization in Kenya, but just about everything else.
Okay.
So
Well,
thank you very much.
that's very kind of you. Thank you. I'm enjoyed talking about these topics. I've been studying and teaching this material for a long time and am very engaged with it. So this is an opportunity for me to refresh my thinking, to think again,
Mm,
and that's as it should be. So I'm grateful to you as well.
all right. Well, this will be all for today. Again, thank you.
Cool. Didn't mean to hit that one. Actually, I probably did. Um, what should we watch? Oh, I fucking 6 more. Let's watch this because I
If we're awarded
this
the
is
grant,
so true.
we will use it on rent in order to open up a few
I'm pretty
more.
sure we've already watched
This episode and
on,
others like
on
it are brought to
stream,
you by the generous support of my
but
patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, join our patrons-only Discord, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. To a non-American, driving down roads lined with American flags, past people dressed like this, past fields where, hand on heart, Americans sing along to the national anthem for even the most forgotten Little League game, and past bars where a USA chant is on a hair trigger is all very strange. Every Ford commercial in this country is about how the US is sick as hell. Every bald eagle is swole. Every beer is a gun.
true.
And a kid just pledging allegiance to the flag is a heartwarming story on national television. In no other country in the world is there such a widespread emotional attachment to the symbols of a bureaucratic government structure. It's incredibly strange, but I get that a lot of patriotism is just having fun. For a lot of people, it's like wearing your team's colors to a game. It's a good time. The problem is that that's not all that patriotism, or its defense, is. Almost every week, I get an email calling me a traitor or anti-American scum. For some reason, in this country, Good faith criticism almost always triggers this knee-jerk reaction that the person raising their concerns, or more often just advocating for their own self-determination, hates America. Let's take an example. Here's an email I got from someone who probably genuinely believes they love their country and thinks what they're doing is a justified defense. And you know what? Let's give this viewer the benefit of the doubt. If you wholeheartedly believe that someone hates you and or the place you call home, it's not entirely unreasonable to get angry with them like this. But here's the thing. If you really want to label yourself patriotic, this kind of approach is completely counterproductive. Think about it for a second. If you care about your country, you should be among the first to call out problems when you see them.
True.
If you love your country and your fellow
Very
Americans,
true.
you should want to fix those problems, not blindly defend them. This kind of behavior isn't patriotic. It's ignorant. All those quote-unquote traitors are doing is bringing attention to problems that all of us should want to solve. There's nothing un-American about caring for your unhoused neighbors. Nothing unreasonable about pointing out that our medical bills are the highest in the world and that we should work to lower them. It's not being a traitor to suggest that the United States is not living up to the standards it claims to set for itself and the rest of the world. And it's not un-American to identify that the root of the problem runs pretty deep. I think we can all agree that these problems exist. That's not the issue most of the time. The issue comes when someone suggests that the cause of these problems is structural and therefore requires structural change. A lot of these problems, these things that we can all agree are hurting people both in this country and beyond our borders, aren't just a matter of bad people. They are an integral part of the American experiment, going all the way back to the country's founding and the principles our economy is built on. And it's okay to point that out. The Constitution allows for amendments because it was written with the idea that things would change. And what was accepted by the Founding Fathers doesn't have to be accepted by us today. Just because the Constitution is still around doesn't mean that everything in it is good or works. It just means that it's a document that effectively protected its own existence. Fun fact, many of the Founding Fathers, who are always portrayed as dusty old dudes in History Channel documentaries, were actually in their 20s. You wouldn't want a constitution written by a bunch of frat boys to be immortal and unchangeable, would you? Okay, so hopefully I've made it clear that a better conception of patriotism would require a willingness to soberly assess and tackle our country's problems. With that, we've already broached the topic of what's called uncritical patriotism. But there's no reason we can't let go of patriotism entirely, and this video will make that claim for American patriotism specifically. Patriotism, especially here in the States, doesn't actually build genuine solidarity like the glorified image of patriotism might have you believe. It's not really about standing together in any meaningful way. Instead, patriotism in this country actually reinforces divisions along aesthetic lines convenient to those in power. It encourages exceptionalist thinking and xenophobia, with consequences neither good for the world nor for average Americans. And having been injected with anti-communist rhetoric during the Cold War, patriotism has become this loyalty to the myth that the US is the sole bastion of goodness and freedom in the world, which makes any claim that something might be wrong, unjust, and possible for us to change seem like a declaration of war. Let's talk about that. Patriotism is always promoted as solidarity. Behind the symbols, the territory, the language, the culture, whatever patriotism attaches itself to, its main draw isn't we all like these three colors, it's community and solidarity with other people. This idea that even people you've never met and will never meet are there for you and you're there for them. It's a nice idea, and said in this abstract way, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But there are a couple problems with the reality of patriotic quote-unquote solidarity. For starters, it obviously doesn't extend to everyone, and patriotic solidarity specifically is weaponized for conservative ends. The political scientist Benedict Anderson puts it very clearly when he says, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship. And as you might expect, this is something that those who benefit from inequality and exploitation can use. If enough people can be convinced that unity along the lines of nationality is more important than pretty much anything else, then calling attention to all the internal conflicts within a society can be swept under the rug as dividing us. For patriots, unity is what makes the country proud and strong, so it's better not to point out how that unity is held together by one group oppressing another, or we might risk losing that unity. But obviously, not calling out oppression benefits the people doing the oppressing. Through the idea of the nation, people come to identify with their exploiters in a way that justifies their continued existence. For example, some people are proud that their country has more billionaires than other countries. For some reason, being born within a couple thousand miles of one another and within the same border gets people to identify with those who have hoarded more wealth than we can even understand.
My cat just fell
Most
off
people
the
share
window.
almost
Poor
nothing
girl.
in common with their country's billionaires, and almost everything with the average person in another country.
You okay?
But that feeling of pride gets them to disregard one set of differences and makes the smaller differences with foreigners seem a lot bigger. As a result, the exploitation that is necessary for billionaires to exist seems less important when we're told it's in the service of something we share, the greatness of America. Even though the greatness of America does almost nothing to make your life better, but billionaires getting tax cuts and skirting labor laws definitely makes it worse. This is something that's really apparent when conservative patriots talk about the experience of Black Americans, for example. In a recent interview, the conservative economist Glenn Loury said, quote, "Look, here we are. We are African Americans, but we are Americans first. We are not African in any way that's meaningful. Yes, our ancestors may have been enslaved, but they were also emancipated. We are literally the richest and most powerful people of African descent on the entire planet. We have 10 times the income on average of the typical Nigerian. There's an enormous black middle class and black billionaires." The translation: pride in the existence of the possibility of black success justifies the continued exploitation of the vast majority of black people. If you are black, you should be grateful to have the incredibly unlikely chance to have more money than you know what to do with, instead of complaining that this system is rigged against you, and in a similar way, is rigged against other black people in another country. By implying that Black Americans should prioritize their national affiliation rather than their class and race, Loury is subtly implying that Black Americans should not be so critical of a system with a legal and policing system that targets and kills them disproportionately, that exploits their racial otherness to deny them a comfortable life unless they assimilate to the dominant white norms of behavior, and that Black Americans should distance themselves from people living in another country whose poverty can be explained, at least in part, by the same phenomenon of slavery that is at the root of the present inequality between black and white people in America. The fact that other people have it worse turns rightful indignation into pride for those who can be convinced, and makes those who stay rightfully indignant look ungrateful. Loury defends capitalism, and he knows that capitalism requires exploitation. He's just hoping that by calling attention to your nationality, you'll accept how exploited you are because someone else has it worse. A non-patriotic approach might look at the inequality between Black Americans and Black Nigerians and find that the plunder of Africa through colonialism and slavery caused both the present inequality between white and Black Americans and the inequality between Americans and Nigerians, and from there can ask what should be done to rectify this injustice, and what structures are keeping it in place. By contrast, a patriotic approach to these facts gets people to think that the best we can do is protect what we have. Never try to get more. Never question the nature of the system as it exists today. And never hope to achieve justice, especially for those not part of the patriotic community. At the end of the day, the existence of black billionaires still relies on the exploitation of black people, and is still supported by the systemic discrimination of black people. But drown all that in a little American pride, and it goes down a lot smoother. To recap, patriotism replaces solidarity among people who suffer under the same structures of injustice, in this case international racial capitalism, and replaces it with solidarity between those who do the oppressing and those who are oppressed.
Bruh.
Let me seriously ask, what is the point of patriotism? Why choose to believe you're better or even meaningfully different from someone on the other side of the world? Your material concerns are the same. You have bills, you want to take care of your family, you want the freedom to pursue your own happiness. There is far more in common between you than the differences created by a borderline decided hundreds of years ago in random wars and brutal, bloody conquests. The world is not going to be made better as long as the oppressed fight one another for the crumbs dropped from the table of the oppressors. Moving on. For patriotism to work, you need to have a general idea about what it is you're patriotic about. And this is one of the great debates of American politics. What is the soul of America? Generally, a patriot might answer with something like freedom, opportunity, or justice. And if that's you, those are good things to defend and give value to. I'm right there with you, 100%. But there is no reason that you need to attach those things exclusively to the US. Absolutely defend freedom. Absolutely defend justice. Absolutely defend opportunity. But why connect those things to this vague idea you'll have to defend too? Because both historically and presently, while American political discourse likes to promote these ideas of freedom and justice, American political action and the structures of American politics and the American economy actively work against these things. I'm not going to rehash all of American history to make this point. Suffice it to say that slavery, manifest destiny, meaning the still ongoing genocide of Native Americans, and the various imperial wars the US has led, are all cases where the nation's first goal and economic motivation was suppressing the freedom of people categorized as others, and therefore outside the mythologized community. Defending something like freedom within the context of American patriotism has rarely ever meant actually defending freedom. And it's almost always meant taking it away from those who were in the way of a greater project of wealth accumulation. And I can already hear a commenter saying something like, if the US can be blamed for, say, Jim Crow, then it should also be praised for the civil rights movement. But I'd argue you'd have a really difficult time defining something as America and showing it was on the right side of the civil rights movement. For example, if America to you means the community of people living in this country, the majority opinion of the US was decidedly against the civil rights movement, with the press calling its leaders like MLK and Malcolm X un-American. If America means the government of this country, then it too was decidedly against the civil rights movement, sending police to crush the protests. If America means the country's founding documents, civil rights for black people is clearly not what America is all about. When it comes to justice, freedom, and opportunity, these things were not achieved for millions of people by being patriotic, but by working outside of and rejecting what was considered American at their time. If you understand why flying the Confederate flag sends a specific message,
I am going
regardless
so
of the
fast
values
with these
people who
levels.
fly it say it
Holy
represents,
shit.
consider how the same things might apply to the American flag. Retroactively, historical moments like the civil rights movement have been folded into the America that one should be patriotic for. But that doesn't mean that freedom isn't still being suppressed in the name of patriotism. When movements for self-determination like BLM and the decolonization movement make waves, for example, the knee-jerk reaction against people wanting a more free society, free for everyone to build their own lives without the threat and exercise of state violence against them, is time and time again patriotism. BLM and decolonization proponents are ruthlessly attacked by an angry mob mobilized not against their ideas, but by the "They Hate America" slogan repeated endlessly on conservative media. These movements are indeed contesting the hegemonic idea of what America is right now, but they are clearly defending the values American patriots claim to hold: freedom, justice, and opportunity.
Yo, you guys having a good time? Let's bring this boat in right.
Finally, we should talk about how anti-communism is a core pillar of American patriotism. Part of the reactionary nature of American patriotism can be explained by the long-standing myths that have surrounded the relationship of the American public with socialist ideas. When movements for justice are called anti-American, they're usually also called Marxist or communist pejoratively. And when movements like the Civil Rights Movement are repackaged into the American patriotic canon, their radicality and the socialist politics of their leaders like MLK are either outright erased or hotly contested, with some even going so far as to say that if MLK was alive today, he'd be a conservative Republican. Two myths inform this idea. One, that America is ontologically capitalist, meaning that it is in the nature of the United States to be a capitalist nation, rather than the more realistic idea that economic systems come and go, and just because the US has a capitalist economy right now doesn't mean it will forever. And two, that capitalism is the only thing that works, and socialism always fails. The second claim is clearly a myth because this isn't what I would call working, and historically, American foreign policy has been intent on crushing socialism rather than letting it fail on its own like the pro-capitalist claim it will. In this country, anti-communism has been something we've nurtured for a long time, with things like the Immigration Acts of 1903 and 1918, which enabled the government to deport foreign-born anarchists, communists, and labor organizers, the successive Red Scares during the 20th century, and obviously the Cold War. The notion that anti-communism is patriotic is a really well-established one. The result is that when combined with capitalist realism, this idea of a resolutely anti-communist, ontologically capitalist America makes it seem like there is no alternative, and anyone proposing anything that would clearly improve your life, if they're doing so by challenging a capitalist norm, might be ruining the only thing that we know works, even if it clearly hasn't been working for a long time now. Patriotism, like capitalist realism, really limits our imagination. When people come up with good ideas about how to change things for the better, if we keep calling them un-American and shooting them down right away, this country won't get any better for the vast majority of the people living both inside and outside its borders. And just to be clear before the video ends, this whole video isn't me coming after you for being American, if you are. There's obviously nothing wrong with just being from here. All I'm saying is that it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to be proud of this vague mythology that is at best a mixed bag. And insisting that everyone here be proud of it only makes it harder for us to change the parts we all agree are bad. Constantly thinking in terms of nation-states like this is really blinding us to the fact that we have a lot more to gain by building solidarity everywhere, all over the world, not just within our own arbitrary borders. Let's let go of patriotism in favor of genuine solidarity. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that my channel is only possible thanks to my patrons on Patreon. As some of you may remember, I used to make general interest science videos. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but it was easy to get sponsors for that kind of content. When I made the switch to political content, something I actually do enjoy, most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, not many brands want to associate with anti-capitalist content, but that means I've had to rely more heavily on the generosity of viewers like you. I've got one reliable sponsor left, and it's a little nerve-wracking not to have much predictable income to count on. If you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate your support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out. We've got everything from a recommended reading list, to a book club, to countless other channels to chat, learn, and explore your interests. We've built a great little community, and we'd love for you to be part of it.
Dungeon Alchemist is an AI-powered map-making application that allows you to make amazing...
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula with your subscription and check out the first 5 episodes of my original series, The New F Word. So, Nespresso is a B Corp now. That seems a little weird. If you haven't heard of them before, B corporations are for-profit companies that have been independently certified as meeting certain social and environmental standards by a nonprofit called B-Lab. Not to be confused with Bone Lab, which is a VR game where you beat up skeletons or something, I don't know. In exchange for running their business according to B-Lab's ethical business code, companies get rewarded for their good behavior with the right to put a little B on their products and in their ads. And that way, consumers know that they're not an evil business and that they're making the world a better place. So now that you know the idea behind B Corps, what is Nespresso doing in that club? Nestle, Nespresso's parent company, is undeniably one of the most evil companies in the world, and it's not even a competition. The company regularly monopolizes the water supply in disenfranchised communities, taps them dry, and then sells the water back to the community at a massive premium in plastic bottles. It's also responsible for rampant malnutrition, disease, and infant mortality in global South countries where it promoted using formula over breastfeeding starting in the 70s, despite knowing full well that the countries it targeted didn't have widespread access to water that is safe for babies to drink. So making formula with it was incredibly dangerous, and as a bonus, unaffordable. Not to mention, still to this day, Nestle uses child slave labor to harvest its cocoa according to multiple NGO investigations. And that's the parent company. Nespresso itself is no better. Nespresso also uses child labor to source its coffee. It has also been found guilty of wage theft. And not to state the obvious, but Nespresso's entire business model is based on selling aluminum pods you can use a grand total of 1 time per tiny shot of espresso. Now, Nespresso says that around 1/3 of its pods get recycled, but there is a lot of skepticism about that number. And even if it's accurate, that's still a conservative 12,600 tons of aluminum going to a landfill every year. Now, I'm no expert, but this doesn't really sound like a company, quote, meeting high standards of verified performance, accountability, and transparency on factors from employee benefits and charitable giving to supply chain practices and input materials. In any case, as much as these past
2 minutes and 32 seconds
might make it seem like I'm going for the all-time any % libel lawsuit speedrun, this video isn't about Nespresso, and it's not about the B Corp certification process either. Those are two interesting topics, but for this video, we're going to zoom out a little and talk about the umbrella that they both fit under: corporate social responsibility. If you haven't heard about this before, it's probably because it has a couple different names. But whether you call it CSR, stakeholder capitalism, or ethical business practices, this video is going to look at how the language of ethical profit making, whether it's honest or dishonest, not only doesn't work, but actually does the opposite of what companies say. CSR, as I'll be calling it for the rest of the video, cements the social inequality, exploitation, and environmental destruction companies say they're fighting against, and in fact actively prevents positive change from happening. That is because beneath a veneer of change, CSR conceals a deep dogmatic commitment to preserving the status quo.
Let me make it clear from the beginning. I have always supported the human right to water. Everyone should have enough clean, safe water to meet their fundamental daily needs. If we give water value, there will be an incentive to invest in looking after our supply.
It used to be the case that companies couldn't care less about having ethical optics. That's a huge generalization, of course. History is rife with examples of companies facing public scrutiny over immoral business practices and rethinking the way they do things. But for a while now, companies operating under the neoliberal consensus have happily adopted Milton Friedman's idea that the only responsibility a business has is delivering profits to its shareholders. After all, it's an idea Milton inherited from Adam Smith, who claimed the invisible hand of the market will naturally tend towards the greatest good when self-interested greed is the driving philosophy of an economic system. You've probably heard that Smith quote that goes, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love." Or along similar lines, quote, "The rich, in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society." That idea, that businesses and the wealthy more generally are just gonna do what they do and consumers and competition will sort things out for the better, had been hegemonic for a long time. But it just isn't anymore, and it's not hard to see why. Left to their own devices, businesses absolutely do not do the right thing. And I can prove that just by saying the words microplastics, pee bottles, and sweatshop, or by putting these two headlines side by side. And just like that, I think I've made my point succinctly enough. Nobody genuinely believes in the invisible hand anymore, so the new mantra of capitalism has become doing well by doing good. Businesses that wish to succeed now face a lot more pressure from the public to take an active role balancing profit with societal
I'm gonna end up getting a drink
responsibility, catering
while
not
I'm
just to shareholders,
cutting my
but
first
all
26 since I
stakeholders,
can,
meaning employees,
since it doesn't stop me
suppliers,
from cutting.
local communities, ecosystems, and even future generations. At least, so goes the story. But of course, plenty of companies are
Let's fucking go.
ready
And
to
I
be
got hit a
completely
lot.
dishonest with this
Damn.
kind of rhetoric. Words like greenwashing and pinkwashing are all too familiar these days because there's just no shortage of companies out there willing to use the language of social justice and ecological sustainability to make a quick buck without actually changing the awful things they do. Whether that's a little green sticker that doesn't mean anything, or promises to be carbon neutral in 50 years without doing anything to change right now, CSR is good PR, so companies are A-OK with Lying. Who wrote that? That was... But what about companies that put their money where their mouth is and actually engage in CSR? The truth is that they aren't any better. And I can make that point with both a weak, realistic case of a company behaving in line with CSR principles, and a strong, hypothetical scenario where I stack the deck against my arguments. Take Salesforce as an example of a realistic case of how CSR works in the real world. Last year, Salesforce made a big show of donating $1.5 million to fund anti-homelessness organizations, and in typical Silicon Valley fashion, launched an anti-homelessness app. Because that's what the anti-homelessness movement needed, an app. But anyway, forget the app. The point is that Salesforce got a bit of good press about their donation in outlets like Business Insider, which they expected because back in 2020, the company got the same kind of favorable coverage when it donated $118 million in education grants, the same year it made $5 billion in quarterly sales. Together, the acts of generosity and sky-high profits got the CEO of Salesforce on CNBC, where this happened.
Can we conclude that being good actually generates great numbers?
Well, as I said, Jim, this is a victory for stakeholder capitalism. It shows that you can do well and you can do good at the same time.
And then the next day, in August of 2020, Salesforce fired 1,000 employees. When companies actively engage in CSR,
Hey, how's it going, buddy?
By doing something charitable or ethical, very often it's not to do actual good, but to divert attention away from the ways they're still doing their usual, morally reprehensible business. CSR, like billionaire philanthropy, exists largely so that companies can launder their reputations and come out looking, if not good, at least marginally better than the rest. Companies rely on consumers succumbing to moral self-licensing, the idea that a little good here justifies evil somewhere else so that they won't face too much backlash. And it works, because we're very vulnerable to it. In a study out of Germany that's consistent with the rest of the literature, researchers found that telling test subjects a towel was made out of organic instead of conventional cotton made them less likely to care about the treatment of workers sewing the towels together than test subjects who are only presented with conventional cotton towels. In the study's own words, if one facet seems ethically fine, another unrelated facet becomes significantly less relevant. Companies know that if they do one good thing, they can get away with continuing to do bad stuff. And in this way, CSR isn't really about creating a more ethical economy, just one where a single instance of good ethics can be traded in for a blank check. But let's assume for a second that we live in a fantasy world where everything I've just said doesn't apply. A world where companies never greenwash and never rely on moral self-licensing to do one good thing so they can cover up all the bad. Basically, a world where ethical businesses are actually ethical all the way through. What would be wrong with CSR then? Well, two things. One, it wouldn't last long, because companies know that they can't be blameless in all aspects of their business and remain profitable. Without universally enforced, rigid standards, voluntary ethics clashes with competition. The market, in most economic sectors, is simply too punishing for good deeds. It's almost always cheaper to do things the unethical way, and that gets reflected in a business's profit margins and in the price at the counter. At the end of the day, most consumers don't have the time to find out which companies are actually doing an ethical job, and which ones don't care or are lying
38.
to them. And
38
most
so
can't
far.
afford not going with the cheapest option or anything but maybe a few choice products.
I do want to make
Wins
some
9
food soon,
times out
though.
of 10 in an economy where there are barely any limitations on how unethical a company can be to bring the price down. In theory, the B Corp certification was supposed to help with the first part of that equation, telling consumers succinctly which companies are good and which ones are not. But like Nespresso or another B Corp, Brewdog, have shown, the little b doesn't really mean that much. And even if it did, paying your workers fairly, eliminating pollution from your manufacturing process, recycling waste in-house, those are all extra expenses for a business. Running an ethical business is fine while the money is steadily flowing in, but the moment the tap starts to run dry, businesses have to make a decision. Either they stay uncompromising in their ethics and run their business into the ground, or they get bought up by a more profitable, less scrupulous competitor, or they become less scrupulous themselves and abandon whatever it was they were doing right. No matter what businesses choose, things get worse. Some companies might make it out of that scramble holding on to their social justice practices, but only exceedingly few. In business, ethics are a luxury. profits are still the bottom line. No matter how much a business waxes poetic about doing well by doing good, the minute they stop doing well, the good can beat it. Under a capitalist system, you cannot be unprofitable. And that will always take precedence over any concern for social and environmental justice. Because if it doesn't, it's Chapter 11 time. The second problem is that the world shareholder capitalists are selling us isn't even desirable in the first place. To quote Anand Giridharadas, it's a vision of the world in which social justice and the concentration of power would somehow increase in tandem ad infinitum. What shareholder capitalists are selling us with their corporate responsibility rhetoric is a world in which change is constantly supervised by the winners of capitalism and their allies. A world where the biggest beneficiaries of the status quo should play the leading role on the ways in which the status quo should be reformed. It's not a more democratic society or a society that's more just. It's a society where the ways in which change happens are exclusively limited to change that doesn't hurt those at the top and businesses' bottom line. It's all based on a promise that businesses will be better without giving up any control, just because it's the right thing to do. And you might be thinking that I'm exaggerating. That, after all, businesses aren't asking for a monopoly on societal change, they just want to participate in the process. You might be thinking right now that if there's something businesses can't do because they need to remain profitable, there's nothing to stop civil society from filling in the gaps, right? Wrong.
This is an opinion you can trust. From Rhonda Schwab, the owner of a BBB-accredited kayak repair shop. Rhonda can...
CSR is a strategy conceived explicitly to avoid structural change and to block off alternative avenues to it. Business leaders are hoping that by giving us crumbs of change, they get to stay in charge, and that the great evils of society that they profit from, things like massive unemployment, poverty, environmental destruction, and so on, don't actually get solved. They prefer a world of band-aids over structural solutions because a structural solution would involve abolishing the power and the privilege they've accumulated under capitalism. And this explanation isn't coming from me, a capitalist-hating commie. Billionaires are openly admitting that this is a last-ditch effort to preserve the status quo they benefit from. Take Vinod Khosla, a billionaire venture capitalist. For years now, he's been arguing for a guaranteed minimum income for everyone, along very similar lines to the CSR crowd. But Khosla isn't doing this for some humanistic reason, but because, quote, to put it crudely, it's bribing the population to be well enough off. Otherwise, they'll work for changing the system. They're just admitting it now. With CSR, companies are making sure that they can continue to profit, that they can remain powerful by using that profit to lobby against strict regulations, and that by showing a little voluntary goodwill, they can prove to us that they should stay totally unaccountable. That might work for a while, but as with any system where power is kept unaccountable, the real test happens during times of crisis. How will you feel when things hit the fan about keeping decision-making power in the hands of an unelected class of business-savvy billionaires whose only claim to power is making the line go up and promising that they would be good? Personally, I don't feel great about that. But ultimately, that is what is being sold to us with CSR. Let us businesses keep making our profits. We'll be good about it. Just don't get involved yourself or actively try to change things in a fundamental way to prevent bad things from happening in the first place. At the end of the day, every company in the world will choose public pressure over public control. You can always just ignore a protest when you're in charge. And to quickly offer some solutions, because I get comments every week complaining that I don't give concrete solutions. I do, by the way, they're just always the same, so I don't put them in every video. Join a socialist organization. Unionize your workplace. Educate yourself, your friends, your coworkers. Without class consciousness and class solidarity, we do not have the power to force change. All we can do is grovel at the feet of the capitalist class. But if we learn from history, if we understand what militant labor has achieved in the past, the victories it's won for us, vacation time, the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour workweek, and so many more, then we can begin to develop mass power and make sure our words aren't seen as complaints, but dictates. No business, however ethical they claim to be, will ever act in the interest of the working class. We have to do that ourselves. Hey there. I'm gonna do this sponsor read a little differently this month because I could really use the support. For the past year or so, I've been working on a Nebula original series called The New F Word. It's a deep dive into the history, ideology, and resurgence of fascism around the world. I'm really proud of what we've produced so far, and if you'd like me to be able to keep making bigger budget original content, please consider signing up for the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle to watch the series. It's less than $15 a year for both platforms.
What else is there? What you got, Nick?
This video is sponsor free and is made thanks.
Let's do this.
It's the day football fans have been waiting for all year, and the energy is palpable.
I'm gonna go see where they are. What are you doing?
I was working on some DIY Valentines.
Yeah, pretty cool, huh?
Okay, that's gonna get...
$68. Let's go.
Hey, you. Yes, you. You want capitalism gone? Good. But let's face it, unless every Discord shit poster with an anime avatar gets equipped with a T-34, the downfall of the biggest system ever built isn't going to be happening any day soon. At least, not in the West. That's why we introduced the well-rounded and not in any way based on my own and my audience's personal experience, the all-encompassing socialist's guide to surviving in capitalism. Well, we can easily blame almost everything on capitalism. Unironically, I don't have enough time to go through every aspect of life which the system damages. Why? Because I can't dedicate my full time to YouTube due to having a job. Because of capitalism. Unironically. So in order to keep this concise, for all you wonderful pill-popping, anxiety-ridden, no-attention span having Tavarishi, we will cut it into 3 parts. Work, money spending, and staying motivated. Some of these might not apply to your conditions, and you should not look at them as being the be-all and end-all approaches to the aspects of life defined previously. Others will make you go, isn't that obvious? Well, for some it might not be. The only thing this video is trying to do is share some experience, mistakes, and lessons me and different comrades have had. Wanting a better world does not mean we should live the one life we have in misery. Get out of here with that liberal moralism.
Do me a favor, please. Get out of here. Get out of here, man. Shit, I'm saying.
Work. Your employer, no matter how nice or mean, will never be able to afford paying you the worth of your work. In this system, profit is what drives them. And even if they attempted to step out of it and support you fully, they would go bankrupt or lose to their competition. Therefore, you're not only competing with your employer's competitors, but with your employer themselves. You owe them nothing, but to the contrary, they owe you. By not paying you enough on what you deliver daily, they exist as a direct antithesis to your thesis. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get it started. Don't overwork yourself. Thousands of data points and statistics show us that the employee who stays extra hours, doesn't take days off, and is extremely loyal to one employer does not end up getting promoted. Work just enough and then oversell it. The same way your employer oversells work benefits to you. Embellish your work experience during interviews. Sometimes straight up lie. Job requirements nowadays are so high, especially in the beginning of a career, that if you were to choose not to lie, you'll most likely be the only one during the interview process who did so. Don't be that guy. You're not that guy,
pal. Trust me, you're not that guy.
If you're given a management position, take it. There will be a manager no matter what, It's better for everyone if it's a Marxist one. But don't get power hungry or you'll end up proving the capitalist's point. Socialism is the workers' ideology, sure, but no socialist project can succeed without allies who are luckier in their experience with the market. I mean, look at Engels. Don't be scared. You can learn most skills when you start the new job, as long as you're not a doctor, pilot, or engineer or something. There are tutorials on literally everything, and yes, you can learn from them. If paid education programs exist at your workplace, take them. But if they're making you pay for them, save your money and learn the skill yourself. Everyone is winging it. Almost nobody's an expert. The only difference between someone who made a mistake at work and what that gets punished for it is who can think up an excuse why something went awry. Don't think your manager knows more about the job than you do. Usually, they're as clueless as you, but have learned how to fake it. Everyone is alienated from their labor, not just you. Remember that the next time a coworker is having a bad day. Don't be a snitch. If you find a better paying job for the same type of work, take it. Loyalty to your boss because they brought pizza over that one time during work hours will end up killing your career. In the best case scenario, you can show them the competitor's offer and ask for a raise. PDF edit the promised salary to look even higher. Extra sneaky. Organize a union or join one when possible. Do so very carefully though. If you get caught before the union is created, you'll be fired at worst and ostracized from a promotion at best. Don't care so much. Literally. This is not your business, you're not an owner, and it's much bigger than you. Whenever you see them not listening to your ideas for improvement, don't get defensive and make enemies. If their approach to whatever task fails, use that, politely, as an argument for your case in the future. But never ruin your relationship with your colleagues or managers because the company leadership chose to do stupid things. Most likely, they're just following orders like you. At the end of the day, do you really care if your company sells 50,000 diapers a day or 51,000 diapers a day? No, you don't. So stop taking yourself so seriously. Your identity is not linked to your workplace. Health is everything. No job or education is worth sacrificing it. Quite literally, I'm not trying to be a hippie here. If you break your back over a job that barely pays the average wage, the damage done to your mind or body will end up costing you far more in the future. Unless you're being directly abused, never change your job before you find an alternative. I'm sure we've all dreamt of just quitting like they do in the movies. But if you don't have money saved and no debt, that could be a fatal mistake. Plus, many people in HR have a thing against employing someone who says they're quote-unquote currently between jobs on an interview. Just don't shoot yourself in the foot, that's all I'm saying. Insist on talking about salaries with people you're organizing or working with. The only person winning when wages aren't discussed amongst employees is the employer. They have all the information on you, but you are rarely given transparency into how the business is run. The first step in taking back some power is when you know just how much you're being underpaid. It might say it's an 8-hour workday with 1 hour worth of break time, but if there are no strict systems of timekeeping available at your workplace, then stretch it out as much as you can. Work hard for half a day and spend the rest relaxing. Obviously, whenever possible. Working from home can cause additional work alienation, but also, for those sneaky enough, much longer sleep time and earlier workday endings. Set your alarm in the morning to only wake you up so you can log in and appear online. Then go to bed with a smile. Office equipment disappears all the time, if you know what I mean. Use your job benefits to the fullest, and always remember, even with them included, you're being underpaid. For example, your workplace gives you X amount of money per week for gas, and you don't use it up. Well, fill up your mom's car instead. Why not? These obviously only scratch the surface, but basically boil down to the following. You need to remember that your worth is not based on your job title or pay. You're a human, not an asset for your boss. Distance your personal identity with that of the firm. or it will swallow you up before you know it. All those corporate drones you avoid at parties, well,
Jesus, I just
believe it
keep
or
getting
not, but
smacked.
they used to be real people like you before a brand replaced their soul, and LinkedIn became their guru. Money spending.
Hi, I'm Will from Zager LLC. If you use Steam, the PC game platform, you could be entitled to hundreds.
Ching ching, you just made a few bucks. Life isn't bad, the sun is shining. You managed to pay off some of your debt, or if you're lucky, actually save a few bucks. Good for you. Now prepare to be bombarded by thousands of carefully designed advertising campaigns telling you what you need, when you need it, and how much of it you need. Get ready to have your very identity molded by how you spend your money. Get ready to be a consumer. And honestly, it's kind of unavoidable at this point. We are all products of the systems and culture we live in, and the socialist is not here to preach some high and mighty liberal notion of modesty to you. To the contrary, let's try and quickly go through different spending habits which capitalism encourages would just leave you wasting your hard-earned money. Brand obsession. While all of us have our preferences for what we want to wear or drive, prices are often inflated beyond reason just because the product comes from a company which is defined as high-end by consumers. All of us know
Whose
this,
fucking bones
but
were
the
that?
trick is not actually continuously falling for it. One little Marxist exercise on getting more conscious about your spending habits is concentrating on what we care about the most, the true labor value of a given product. Is what you want to buy truly made by experts in decent conditions, therefore relatively justifying the increase in prices, or is the company you're buying from using their brand status to get away with exploitative low-skill labor? This is not to undermine low-skill labor, but to the opposite, a simple trick which tells you the real worth of that given product, and just how much the brand sells in quality versus advertising. Marx didn't write about advertising per se, but his writing on alienation has a lot to say about the process of advertising. He said, and I quote, that selling is the process of alienation. Because we are underpaid, we cannot afford to buy everything in the market, so the sellers have to compete. And why compete based on quality and use value when you can compete based on who can build a stronger and more recognizable brand? Don't fall for it all the time. It's a bloody meme at this point. Frequency of consumption. Systemic alienation leads us to an eternal search for easy and quick fixes for our inherent unhappiness. While substance abuse and mental health have thankfully become mainstream topics of discussion, addiction to consumerism is not. Marx wrote that alienation made it possible for us to seek to meet our human needs in such a distorted way that a whole range of products, which are completely unnecessary and even harmful, became central to our sense of self-worth. Pinpointing the reasoning behind your drive to continuously purchase new and new and new and new things can do a lot of good for your wallet and your health. Differentiate consumption for need and consumption that makes you feel good for a couple of hours. Because if the latter dominates your buying habits, you're deeper into the consumerist rabbit hole than you think. To all according to their need, is what Daddy Mark said. So follow it and limit how much extra money capitalists make selling you shit you really don't have any use for. This isn't the conscious buying shtick high-end eco-friendly companies want to sell you on, but a simple approach to a big problem, questioning why you're buying something before you buy it. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. This eternal truth should preserve you from assuming you have almost any impact on the global environmental crisis. Because, my friend, you don't. So don't feel guilty about it. That said, though, when possible and affordable, you lose nothing by trying to live a more sustainable life. Sometimes it could even give you hopeful purpose, which isn't all that bad in this grim, dark world of ours. Maintain your car, home and more expensive items. The price for upkeep is always lower than the price you'll have to pay to fix it. Many manufacturers are making more money on fixing their broken or defunct products than actually selling them. See my video on why capitalism makes shit products to learn more. Renting versus buying. I will get a lot of shit for this one, but I have to say it. If you have enough money, do try and escape renting. It's unstable and insecure, no matter how many arguments are made in favor of it by capitalists. Without your own personal home, you are always at risk of greater exploitation by the system, the banks, and your workplace. It's extremely difficult to get a home nowadays. I get it, but I repeat, if possible, do escape putting food on your landlord's lychee dinner table. Chances are your rent is probably higher than their bloody mortgage in the first place. And some mini tips. Use public transportation when possible. It's cheaper and often safer. Try your local union for a loan before going to a bank. Balance out food quality and price, because saving on food today means paying the doctor tomorrow. Treat yourself whenever possible, while at the same time following the rules previously put out. Help homeless people. Like seriously, give them some change and don't question what they'll be spending it on. They have enough problems as is. Don't buy self-help bullshit or follow gurus which conveniently want to sell you $5,000 studying packages. There is no easy way out of the system. Either cheat it, work it, or suffer under it. And finally, there is no guilt in living a good life as long as it is not at the expense of others. As class-conscious individuals, we shouldn't feel jealousy towards members of our own class who are a bit luckier, as we risk to alienate them from the cause. And if we end up being the lucky ones, we must strive to never lose the class consciousness which most likely led us to the place in life we are in. After savings, whatever you have left that you do not need, if possible, donate to socialist projects you believe in. And if you have actual time on your hands, participate in them or create your own. Mutual aid, food donation kitchens, and direct action in general are perfectly lovely places to start. And hey, if something's left after that, check out my Patreon, eh? Staying a motivated anti-capitalist isn't an easy task. The system pushes you to sell out at every corner, and your past ignorance towards how the world works feels like a comfortable position you sometimes yearn to go back to. As the political climate seems dangerously doomer-pilled, we take any sunshine that we can get. A military coup being defeated here, or some additional healthcare there. But deep down inside, our yearning for true freedom feels out of reach and distant. But then again, is it really? There's two fish in a barrel. One of them thinks it's the ocean. The other one knows it's trapped in a barrel local drunkards often piss in. Realistically, they're both in the same situation, and the first dumb fish arguably has a far greater chance of being what is commonly defined as happier. But the second one, in its knowledge of the circumstances which it found itself in, has something far more valuable than ignorant happiness. It knows that the rules she was always told about were supposed to apply to the ocean, a thing just like success in capitalism, which she might never see. And with this knowledge, she can swim with far more purpose and elegance in a barrel than an ignorant one could in a planet of oceans. True freedom means looking into and questioning the presuppositions of everything which is given to us by the hegemonic ideology. Questioning even freedom itself and never abandoning the struggle. Wow, thank you for watching. If you like what I do here, consider supporting it by subscribing or donating over on Patreon. For the price of less than a can of beer a month, you can help this channel run. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the wonderful, wonderful Tavarishi without whom this would never even have been possible. Especially Deep Red Wine, B. Matt, Soup, Nathan Moore, Luxbeer, Nibino, John P. Fritchie, Aaron Reba, Sophie, Bradley Young, Cap.
All right, I'm gonna head off for a bit. I'm gonna take like an hour off. I'm gonna eat, and I'm gonna get right back at it. So thank you guys so much for watching. I will be back in like an hour or so. All right, we'll probably just